The Jeep sat in my driveway like a quiet sentinel. Matte green, unmarked, built to handle anything. It wasn't the kind of vehicle most people saw in a neighborhood like this. Neat lawns, pastel shutters, and neighbors who cared more about matching mailboxes than anything real. To them, my Jeep was an eyesore. To me, it was more than transportation. It was assigned equipment, tied to my work with a state police task force. Inside it held sensitive gear, surveillance equipment, and paperwork that couldn't just end up in the wrong hands. That's why I kept it secured behind a heavy-duty gate and a thick chain lock. From the moment I moved in, the stares started. Most neighbors kept their distance, but not Karen. She was the HOA president, the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards. She had a way of talking like every sentence was a rule, like every decision was hers to make. Her smile was tight, and her questions were invasive. She didn't like that my Jeep didn't fit her picture-perfect world. "Military vehicles aren't really appropriate here," she'd said once, standing at the edge of my driveway like she owned it. I simply told her it wasn't her concern. That didn't sit well. Soon after, I caught her circling the property with her little clipboard, jotting down notes like she was preparing a case against me. She left printed warnings, taped to my gate. Even though the HOA had no authority over my property, I ignored her at first, thinking she'd eventually find a new target. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who let go. She thrived on control. And behind that polite tone and those fake smiles, I could sense she was planning something. I just didn't know then how far she'd actually go to prove her power. The morning it happened felt strangely calm. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft orange glow across the quiet street. I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, ready to start my shift later that day, when something immediately felt off. The gate that had always stood firmly locked hung open, the thick chain lying on the gravel like a dead snake. My stomach tightened. I moved closer, scanning the ground for signs of what went wrong. That's when I saw the bolt cutter marks on the metal, clean, deliberate cuts. Someone hadn't just tampered with it. They'd broken in. And then I saw the Jeep, or rather, the space where it should have been. The empty driveway hit me like a punch to the gut. That wasn't just my vehicle. It was a task force Jeep, filled with restricted equipment. My training kicked in before panic could take over. I checked the security camera mounted near the garage. Sure enough, there she was. Karen. Striding through my property in broad daylight like she owned it. Her smug face was illuminated by the porch light she probably didn't even realize was on. She walked right up, cut the chain, and called someone on her phone. A flatbed tow truck appeared minutes later. Watching the footage, a mix of disbelief and anger built in my chest. This wasn't just a petty HOA warning anymore. She had broken onto private property and stolen government equipment. I knew she didn't realize what she'd done. She probably thought she was enforcing community rules. But ignorance wasn't going to protect her from what would come next. My first call wasn't to the HOA. It was straight to my task force supervisor. What she had set in motion was far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. She'd just messed with the wrong Jeep. The first call to my supervisor was short and tense. He didn't waste time asking unnecessary questions. The moment I told him the Jeep had been taken, his voice dropped into that clipped, no-nonsense tone I knew well. "Secure the area. Don't touch anything else. We're on our way." Within 20 minutes, two unmarked SUVs rolled up the street, their engines humming low, their presence sharp against the quiet neighborhood. It wasn't just about a stolen vehicle anymore. That Jeep held equipment used in active operations, sensitive information, and someone, without any clearance, had just hauled it off on a tow truck like it was a broken-down car. I watched as two agents began dusting the cut lock for prints, others taking photos of tire tracks. Every detail mattered. This wasn't just standard procedure, it was a federal matter now. The HOA's little game had crossed a line they couldn't even comprehend. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, some pretending to water lawns, trying to figure out why men in tactical jackets with sidearms were moving around my driveway. Karen's porch light flicked on across the street, and I saw her silhouette standing there, hands on hips, watching like she had won something. She had no idea what kind of storm was coming for her. One of the agents turned to me. "We'll trace the tow truck. Don't confront anyone yet. This is ours now." I nodded, keeping my composure, but inside my patience burned thin. Karen's arrogance wasn't just annoying anymore. It was dangerous. She had put herself, and the entire neighborhood, in the middle of something far bigger than HOA drama. What she thought was a petty power move had just triggered a federal investigation. And soon, that smug little clipboard of hers was going to be the least of her worries. By noon, the investigation had already started unraveling the threads of Karen's mistake. The tow company she had called wasn't a random pick. She'd arranged it through the HOA's so-called compliance committee. In her mind, she was enforcing a neighborhood code she had invented. She'd even signed a bogus violation removal order, with the HOA letterhead, pretending to have authority over my property. The tow truck driver, not realizing he was hauling a law enforcement vehicle, did exactly as she told him. It was almost impressive how confidently wrong she had been. The agents traced the truck to a storage yard on the edge of town. That's where they found the Jeep, parked behind a chain-link fence, untouched but sealed off. The moment they confirmed the vehicle was secure, I felt some of the tension in my chest ease, but only slightly. The damage was already done. The entire task force had to log the incident, run diagnostics, and account for every piece of equipment. A federal vehicle being taken off-site like that wasn't something they brushed aside. Meanwhile, word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People whispered on their lawns, wondering why federal agents were crawling all over the area. Karen strutted around with her usual sense of self-importance, pretending she'd done something noble for community aesthetics. She didn't even realize the severity of her actions. When two agents approached her front door, clipboard in hand, her expression shifted. I stood at a distance, watching the exact moment her smug confidence began to crack. They didn't cuff her on the spot. That wasn't how it worked, but the tone of their questions made it clear this wasn't just a warning. She wasn't dealing with a neighbor anymore. She was dealing with federal law enforcement. And for the first time since I'd moved here, Karen had no control over what happened next. Karen tried to play it cool when the agents questioned her, standing in her doorway like a self-appointed authority figure. She spoke in that clipped, patronizing tone she used on everyone, as if she were correcting a child. "That vehicle violated our neighborhood code," she said, crossing her arms. "We don't allow those kinds of militarized vehicles here." She didn't realize, or maybe she refused to, that the men in front of her weren't HOA board members. They were federal agents with badges and very little patience for suburban power trips. One of them pulled out a printed copy of the fake violation order she'd written and calmly asked her to explain where she'd gotten the authority to sign and authorize it. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Her words stumbled slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. "I'm the HOA president," she finally said. "I can enforce rules. I have jurisdiction." The agent's eyebrow lifted just slightly. He didn't have to say a word for her to start realizing how far out of her depth she was. When they told her the vehicle belonged to a state task force, and that tampering with it was a federal offense, the blood drained from her face. She stammered about not knowing, about just trying to keep the neighborhood nice. But ignorance wasn't a legal defense. Everything she'd done was documented. Security footage, forged papers, phone records. Her signature was on all of it. As they handed her a formal notice and told her she was under federal investigation, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. She wasn't being arrested yet, but the warning was clear. Karen wasn't the one in charge anymore. She had stepped into a fight she could never win. And the consequences were only beginning. The day after the agents questioned her, the neighborhood felt different. People who once avoided confronting Karen suddenly seemed to be watching her every move. Her morning power walk, once accompanied by that little clipboard and a self-satisfied smile, was replaced by a stiff, uneasy shuffle. The air of authority she carried had cracked. Word had spread fast. She'd messed with law enforcement property, and federal agents were involved. Even those who used to blindly support her HOA antics were keeping their distance now. I kept my distance too, but I didn't have to lift a finger. The wheels of justice were already turning. I received updates from my supervisor. The task force had finished their sweep of the Jeep, confirming nothing had been compromised. But they were filing official charges for tampering with a government vehicle, trespassing, and impersonation of authority. All her smug attempts at control had now turned into a legal avalanche heading straight for her. Later that afternoon, a black SUV returned to the neighborhood. Karen, standing on her porch, froze as two agents approached with more paperwork. It wasn't an arrest, but it was a formal federal summons. The scene played out in full view of curious neighbors peeking from behind curtains. The woman who once handed out petty fines for unapproved paint colors now stood with trembling hands, accepting documents that could ruin her. I watched quietly from my porch, coffee in hand, letting the satisfaction settle in. I hadn't needed to confront her, argue, or fight her games. She had exposed herself entirely through her own arrogance. The Jeep sat securely behind the gate again, the new lock shining in the sun. Karen's reign as the untouchable HOA queen was over, and the best part was, she had done it to herself. A few days later, the calm exterior of the neighborhood started to fracture. What had once been Karen's stage for petty control had turned into a quiet spectacle. Everyone knew. Neighbors who used to fear her rule started whispering openly, and her once loyal board members began distancing themselves fast. People weren't just annoyed by her anymore, they were terrified of being dragged down with her. The HOA meetings that were usually filled with her lecturing tone and her rigid rules now sat empty, chairs unclaimed. Even the usual decorative banners she'd ordered were taken down overnight. Behind the scenes, the legal machine kept moving. I got a call from my supervisor informing me that federal prosecutors were officially taking up the case. Her forged paperwork, the unauthorized towing, and the breach of a secure vehicle had elevated this beyond just a slap on the wrist. She wasn't facing a fine. She was facing potential prison time. I knew they wouldn't throw the book at her like a hardened criminal, but it wouldn't be pretty either. And more importantly, she would lose everything that gave her power. Karen tried to act unfazed, but the cracks were showing. She walked around the neighborhood without her clipboard now, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The woman who once stormed into my driveway uninvited couldn't even look in my direction. When she saw the task force vehicle parked behind the locked gate again, she visibly flinched, like it was a ghost haunting her. I didn't celebrate out loud. I didn't have to. The silence around her was louder than any revenge speech I could have delivered. She had ruled this neighborhood through fear and false authority, but now, even her closest allies were letting her sink alone. Power had finally shifted. A few days later, the calm exterior of the neighborhood started to fracture. What had once been Karen's stage for petty control had turned into a quiet spectacle. Everyone knew. Neighbors who used to fear her rule started whispering openly, and her once loyal board members began distancing themselves fast. People weren't just annoyed by her anymore, they were terrified of being dragged down with her. The HOA meetings that were usually filled with her lecturing tone and her rigid rules now sat empty, chairs unclaimed. Even the usual decorative banners she'd ordered were taken down overnight. Behind the scenes, the legal machine kept moving. I got a call from my supervisor informing me that federal prosecutors were officially taking up the case. Her forged paperwork, the unauthorized towing, and the breach of a secure vehicle had elevated this beyond just a slap on the wrist. She wasn't facing a fine. She was facing potential prison time. I knew they wouldn't throw the book at her like a hardened criminal, but it wouldn't be pretty either. And more importantly, she would lose everything that gave her power. Karen tried to act unfazed, but the cracks were showing. She walked around the neighborhood without her clipboard now, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The woman who once stormed into my driveway uninvited couldn't even look in my direction. When she saw the task force vehicle parked behind the locked gate again, she visibly flinched, like it was a ghost haunting her. I didn't celebrate out loud. I didn't have to. The silence around her was louder than any revenge speech I could have delivered. She had ruled this neighborhood through fear and false authority, but now, even her closest allies were letting her sink alone. Power had finally shifted. The official hearing date arrived sooner than anyone in the neighborhood expected. A subpoena had been delivered to Karen's doorstep, and the news spread faster than any HOA notice ever had. She tried to keep a low profile, but in a place where everyone watched everyone else, her every move was under silent surveillance. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks, pretending to tend to their gardens while exchanging updates like they were passing state secrets. For once, Karen wasn't the one pulling the strings, she was the headline of the scandal. I attended the hearing as a witness, sitting quietly behind the task force representatives. The courtroom was colder than I imagined, its air heavy with quiet judgment. Karen sat at the defense table looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her usual stiff posture replaced by slumped shoulders. Gone was the clipboard, the fake smile, the superiority. All that was left was a woman who had no idea how far she'd stepped beyond her limits. The prosecution laid everything out with surgical precision. Security footage of her cutting the lock, the falsified violation notice with her signature, the call logs to the tow company, the testimony from the driver who said she sounded official. It wasn't just damning, it was airtight. Her lawyer tried to argue that it was a misunderstanding, but the judge didn't seem amused. Tampering with a government vehicle was not a misunderstanding. When they read out the list of charges and potential penalties, Karen's face drained of all color. She finally understood this wasn't some HOA spat she could bully her way out of. She was now a defendant in a federal courtroom. Watching her finally face real consequences didn't just feel like justice. It felt like balance being restored after months of chaos she had caused. The fallout from the hearing rippled through the neighborhood like a shockwave. For years, Karen had built her power on intimidation, paperwork, and a tone that made grown adults feel like scolded children. But now, that power had crumbled in a single morning. The court hadn't delivered a final sentence yet, but the charges were serious enough to strip her of every bit of authority she once clung to. The HOA board voted to suspend her indefinitely while the case played out. The woman who used to dictate everything from lawn height to paint colors now couldn't even enter a board meeting. Neighbors who once jumped at her commands now crossed the street to avoid her. Some were still afraid to speak openly, but their silence was no longer loyalty, it was relief. A few even came by to apologize to me for not standing up sooner. I didn't hold it against them. Everyone had been living under the shadow of her control for too long. I could see in their faces the same quiet satisfaction I felt. The queen of petty power trips had finally been dethroned. Meanwhile, the task force wrapped up their final reports. The Jeep had been cleared, and the incident had been officially logged. There would be no loose ends. I wasn't the one who brought Karen down. She had done it entirely to herself. Her arrogance, her need for control, and her belief that rules didn't apply to her had led her to this point. One evening, I saw her through my front window, standing on her porch staring at the street. No clipboard, no smug grin, just a woman realizing she'd lost everything she built on fear. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to everyone again, not just her. Weeks later, the final verdict came down. Karen stood in court, dressed in muted colors, a far cry from the bold blazers she used to wear while marching through the neighborhood like she owned it. The judge's voice was steady and firm as he handed down the sentence. Probation, community service, and a hefty fine for the damage and legal costs she caused. While she avoided prison time due to a clean record, the weight of a federal conviction would follow her forever. The woman who once thrived on control now had none. The news spread fast. The HOA officially removed her from the board, stripped her of all decision-making power, and appointed an interim committee. The once feared figure was now just another neighbor with no authority. The same people who once followed her rules to the letter now openly rolled their eyes when her name came up. She walked through the neighborhood with her head down, no longer greeted with fake smiles or forced nods of respect. She was no longer a leader, just a cautionary tale. The task force closed the case officially that same week. My supervisor gave me a firm nod and a simple line, "Handled well." The Jeep sat in my driveway again, secure behind a new reinforced lock. For the first time since moving there, I didn't feel the weight of Karen's constant scrutiny. That weekend, the neighborhood held its first HOA meeting without her. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. People spoke openly, laughed, and actually listened to one another. As I leaned back in my chair, I realized the fight was never really about a Jeep. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could bully their way through life. And in the end, she learned power isn't real when it's built on fear.